What we now want to look at are somatic motor reflexes. We're on page 86, and the first thing I'd like to remind everybody of is a concept that you all learned about in human anatomy. You learned in anatomy, they made you learn the action of muscles, and they also asked you to learn the antagonist, the muscle that has the opposite action. Most of the muscles in our body are organized into opposing groups. So if we have a muscle, for example, that causes, let's say, flexion of our forearm, we have an opposing muscle that causes extension of the forearm. I'll just remind you what it is. The primary mover, the main muscle that causes flexion, is the Biceps Brachii. It's not the only one, but it's the prime mover. And of course, the muscle that causes extension of the forearm is the Triceps Brachii. So you should still remember this from anatomy, because we have to use examples of this. Here they are, is where they're located anatomically. Another example, so we can alternately flex our lower leg or extend the lower leg. We obviously do both when we walk. And the muscle that extends our lower leg is called the Quadriceps femoris muscle that extends. And the muscles that cause bending or flexing of our legs are commonly called the hamstring group. That's not a technical name, so the major hamstring muscle, there are three of them. The major one is called the Biceps Femoris, and the other two are the semimembranosus and semitendinosus. So those cause flexion. Now, these are just some examples. Incidentally, at the bottom of the page, right here, you can see the quadriceps on the anterior front side that extend, and the hamstrings, including the biceps femoris, that cause bending or flexion. I can do this for most parts of our body. Let me just give you a few more examples. So on our neck, we have the sternocleidomastoid. Some of you might remember, it causes bending or flexing at the neck. And the antagonist is the splenius muscle that extends and hyperextends at the neck. We have muscles, abdominal muscles, such as the rectus abdominis, that causes bending or flexing at the waist. And we have all these muscles of our back, including the spinalis dorsi, that extend and hyperextend our back. So we could just talk about this over and over as far as how muscles are organized in opposing groups. This concept is going to be very important in physiology, as well as it was in anatomy. We'll come back to that. Now, what's listed next is we are reminded that the somatic motor neurons that control our skeletal muscle, they primarily originate in the ventral gray horns of our spinal cord, as it says right here. They also originate in the gray matter of the brainstem, but especially in the ventral gray horns of the spinal cord. The somatic motor neuron and all of the skeletal muscle cells it controls, it commands, make up what's called a motor unit. So we've said a motor unit is a little bit like the idea of a commanding officer and all the soldiers under his command. So the somatic motor neuron and all the skeletal muscle cells that are under its command. Now on page 87, so in 87 it says influences from higher brain centers. Well, we've already learned about this. There is both voluntary control of somatic motor neurons, and right here it says involuntary control, involuntary adjustments of posture and balance. So we wrote that the voluntary control, the motor pathway originates in the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. That's what we've been reviewing today, in the frontal lobe. The signals travel from the primary motor area of the frontal lobe down the pyramidal tract, also known as the corticospinal tract. And these myelinated interneurons on the way cross or decussate. And because they do cross or decussate, as we wrote right here, the right side of your brain actually controls the muscles, the somatic motor neurons and muscles on the left side of the body, and vice versa, because they decussate. So let's just show you another picture of this by looking at the very next page. So on the very next page, on the left-hand side, this is labeled the voluntary pathway on the left. And this is just showing how the neural pathway, the voluntary neural pathway between our cerebral cortex and the skeletal muscles works. Let's just follow it. So the voluntary pathway begins in the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. The signals begin here in the primary motor area, in the frontal lobe. Let's follow this down. Here's the corticospinal or pyramidal tract. And once it reaches the medulla oblongata, and our thought is, what's that? That's the name of the lowest part of the brain. So right at the medulla oblongata, I want you to notice what's happening right here. And I wrote it. This is where, at the bottom of the brain, these corticospinal or pyramidal tract neurons decussate. They cross. So now, as this neuron travels down the spinal cord, it is now on the opposite side of the nervous system. So in this picture, this signal began, as you look at it, on the right, and now it's on the left. Okay, where did it decussate? In the bottom of the brain, in an area called the medulla oblongata. And then here it shows this corticospinal or pyramidal tract neuron that's been traveling down the white matter, because that's where myelinated neurons are. That's what makes it look white. It leaves the white matter, enters the gray matter, and is shown synapsing onto a somatic motor neuron. And so it could activate the somatic motor neuron to the skeletal muscle. So again, it just takes two neurons to connect that, to send a signal from the cerebral cortex to a skeletal muscle. The myelinated interneuron of the pyramidal or corticospinal tract and the myelinated somatic motor neuron. Two neurons in that circuit, in that sequence. We've seen another picture of this as well. I'll just remind you, again, just for the purpose of being repetitive. If we look back on the amazing picture on 66A, this was our amazing picture on page 66A. And we're all thinking, oh, that mess. Yeah. So we saw right here, this is showing the same thing. Here's this myelinated interneuron synapsing onto a somatic motor neuron. So that's the voluntary pathway through this. Okay, now let's go back to page 87. And on 87, in the middle of page 87, it says involuntary. So there's these involuntary adjustments of our skeletal muscle for maintaining posture and balance. These signals originate in the basal ganglia, which is also known as the basal nuclei of the brain, and the cerebellum. And the signals then travel down the extrapyramidal tract to the very same somatic motor neurons. This little scheme that I've drawn here is absolutely identical to what was on page 108 on that big diagram, where here we can see signals from the cerebellum and basal ganglia to the midbrain, which can activate or initiate signals in the extrapyramidal tract to the somatic motor neurons. But let's show you a picture of this. Let's look again on the next page, and this time, the involuntary pathway. And where I want to begin this involuntary pathway is right here on the right, where it says Purkinje cell of cerebellum. Now, we're not going to worry about what a Purkinje cell is. It's just the name of a neuron. There are some neurons in the cerebellum named after Dr. Purkinje. They're called Purkinje cells. Don't worry about it. Cerebellum. We're beginning in the cerebellum. Now, you'll notice there's arrows here. So it's showing that signals can be sent by neurons in the cerebellum. And let's follow the arrows. I'm following the arrows up to here. So apparently signals can go from the cerebellum to here. And what's here? The midbrain. And we have learned that what originates in the midbrain are the myelinated interneurons of the extrapyramidal tract. All right, so this is a myelinated interneuron of the extrapyramidal tract. Let's follow it downwards. And so here we see where it synapses onto a somatic motor neuron controlling a skeletal muscle. So let's summarize this involuntary pathway. Where did this involuntary pathway in this example begin? In the cerebellum. Whatever the cerebellum part of your brain is doing, you're not aware of. The only part of your brain, when it does anything that you're aware of what it's doing, is the very top of your brain, the cerebral cortex. Any neural activity that's occurring in all these other places of your brain or spinal cord, you're not aware of. It's all operating subconsciously, which means that a large part of our brain is operating subconsciously in the background that we're not aware of. All right, so here's the signal is sent from the cerebellum up to the midbrain. Then the signal travels down this extrapyramidal tract and activates or inhibits the somatic motor neuron to the skeletal muscle. That did not involve the cerebral cortex at all. So whenever that happens, you're not conscious of. Okay, back on the previous page, 87. Now that I've reviewed these neural pathways, now we want to talk about somatic motor reflexes. Now, we've learned that reflexes can be innate, that means built in, or they can be learned. We're going to focus primarily on those that are built in, innate, but I will mention, before we're done, a little bit about learned somatic motor reflexes. The two major types of built-in or innate somatic motor reflexes that I'm going to present are what are known as anti-gravity stretch reflexes, these stretch reflexes, and what we will call withdrawal reflexes. So there are stretch reflexes and withdrawal reflexes. We'll get to withdrawal. All right? The purpose of a stretch reflex is to counteract gravity. That's its purpose, to counteract gravity. Now, what's an example of this anti-gravity stretch reflex? And I'm just going to pull this back here. An example of this anti-gravity stretch reflex is the most famous reflex all of you have heard of. And that's where you tap somebody's knee and their leg moves. So obviously you tap the knee, the leg moves, everybody's heard of this, people have done it. Our question is, what the hell is it for? And the answer is to counteract gravity. Let me begin by mentioning gravity is a major challenge to us, to our bodies. It is an extremely big problem for our bodies, for every system of our body. So when you find that it's difficult to get up in the morning, to go from that lying position to standing up, it's not just in your own mind, it's not because you're lazy, it is really difficult. Your body is much more comfortable lying on that mattress because as you stand up, you've now got to work against the pull of gravity, which wants to pull you right back or down onto that mattress. So every time you sit up, every time you stand up, you are working against gravity. Now, most of us get ourselves up in the morning, and over the course of the day, gravity is basically pulling against us all day long, and by the time the evening arrives, gravity is winning. And so we reach, by whether it's 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the evening, by 12 midnight, everybody just ready to collapse into bed because you've had it, because of mostly gravity. Gravity is a huge pull, constantly pulling us downwards that we have to fight against. Now, the cool thing is that we have built-in reflexes to help us fight gravity, so we don't have to consciously think about it so much. I want to give you an example of what I mean. When I watch students from my vantage point as a teacher, so here's what I notice with students. So you're kind of in the morning, you're kind of like this. And then what happens is your head drops like this. That's gravity, right? Gravity pulls your head down. Then gravity causes you to bend at the waist. So now you're bent over at the waist. And the only last thing that's left is for your knees to buckle and you fall to the floor. All right? That's gravity pulling you down to the ground. Now, you'll notice that the 3 examples I just gave of your head bending, and this is what happens when people get sleepy. Your head bends, then you start to lie on your desk, right? You bend at the waist, and then you fall to the floor. Okay, most students don't fall to the floor. All those examples I've just given you all involve gravity causing bending or flexing of your body. So gravity pulls your head down. That's a flexion. Gravity causes bending at the waist. That's a flexion. Gravity causes bending at your knees. That's a flexion. So how we counteract this bending at the neck is using the extensor muscle on the back of our neck, the splenius. We have to keep that splenius contracted to keep our head upright. To counteract the bending at the waist, we have to use our back muscles. You are using your back muscles right now to be sitting upright. You're not using your abdominal muscles so much as you're using those back muscles, which extend your back. The abdominal muscles cause it bending. And when you're standing upright, you are using the quadriceps muscle to extend your lower legs. All right? You don't have to use your hamstrings, which cause bending. So because we use our extensors to counteract gravity, principally we use our extensors to counteract gravity, that's why they work all day long and they become more tired than our flexors. What do I mean by that? So at the end of the day, right, our muscles, our extensor muscles, like the splenius on the back of our neck is tired. And that's why we like to get massaged there, because it's tired. And our back muscles are tired. So while a good massage everywhere in our body would feel great, a massage on our back, the back of our neck and our back, we all appreciate more than even a massage on our tummy. All right? Because that's where those muscles have been tensed all day long to counteract gravity. So this anti-gravity reflexes, or stretch reflexes, help us maintain the desired posture of sitting upright, of standing upright, counteracting the pull of gravity. Because gravity tends to pull your head and trunk down and forward, but the muscle tone in certain muscles of your neck and back overcome the force of gravity. Now, we call this tension that is maintained in your muscles to keep your head up and your back up all day long. We call this tension tonus. Tonus. There's tonus or tension in those muscles all day long to counteract gravity. Now, I want to have you demonstrate to yourselves the fact that there's a built-in reflex that is counteracting gravity. So here's what I'd like you to do. Just to shake your arms and drop your hands to your sides. Okay? Just shake and drop your hands to your side. Okay? Are they relaxed? You're just resting at your sides. All right? Look at your fingers. And say, okay, I have fingers. Something's not right. You'd say, what do you mean something's not right? Point your fingers straight down to the ground, to the floor. Point them down. Gravity is pulling everything straight down. Your fingers should be pointing straight down. Now relax your fingers. Notice they just bent slightly up away from the floor. Let's try that again. Drop your hands, point your fingers to the floor. That's what gravity should be doing. Gravity is pulling everything straight down. But in fact, when you relax the tension in your fingers, they bend slightly up against the pull of gravity. Well, who's doing that? These anti-gravity reflexes. As long as you're alive, these anti-gravity reflexes are counteracting gravity, as long as you're alive. But when somebody dies, then their fingers do point straight down, because there's no longer this anti-gravity reflex kicking in. As long as you're alive, your fingers, when you relax them, start to bend slightly up away from the pull of gravity. That's what we wrote right here at the bottom. So how does this reflex work? So let's look on page 89. And on page 89, So what we're looking at right here is the basis of this anti-gravity stretch reflex. Now, every reflex has to be initiated by a sensory neuron. Let me remind you, we have already learned the components of a reflex. The components of a reflex include a sensory neuron, an interneuron, a motor neuron, and an effector. The structures that are the sensory neurons in this are associated with these structures embedded in our skeletal muscles called muscle spindles. And you probably did not hear about them at all in an anatomy class. So embedded between your skeletal muscle fibers or skeletal muscle cells are these structures called muscle spindles. And these muscle spindles are as long as the muscle is. They're quite long. If we enlarge one of these muscle spindles that are shown here in this picture, it would look like the picture you see on the right. This is a muscle spindle. Now, it's much longer than what's shown. We're just looking at part of it. It extends further up and further down. It kind of bulges right here in the middle. Inside the muscle spindle are special skeletal muscle fibers, skeletal muscle cells. These skeletal muscle cells are very thin, and because they are contained within this muscle spindle structure, they are called intrafusal muscle cells, or intrafusal muscle fibers. Intrafusal because they are inside the muscle spindle. Intra means inside. Okay, fine, we've got some special muscle cells inside this muscle spindle, so what? The most important part of this structure, the most important part is the next thing I'm going to mention. Wrapped around these very thin skeletal muscle cells is a sensory neuron called a muscle stretch receptor. We know that if it has the ending receptor, it's a sensory neuron. Now, why this sensory neuron is called a muscle stretch receptor is anytime these intrafusal muscle cells become stretched, that initiates an action potential in this sensory neuron. So it is activated by stretch. And they will send that action potential or signal to your central nervous system. And we'll see what happens next. I do want to mention that there are some special motor neurons, somatic motor neurons, that synapse onto these very thin intrafusal skeletal muscle cells, and they can make these intrafusal muscle cells contract. The name of these somatic motor neurons is they're called gamma somatic motor neurons. So gamma somatic motor neurons can change the tension on these intrafusal muscle fibers. Now, I want to show you where that word gamma somatic motor neuron first appears. It actually requires that we go back to page 65. And back on page 65, you had on the lower right this picture on page 65. And we saw that coming right here from originating in the ventral gray horns are somatic motor neurons. But look carefully. One of the somatic motor neurons is labeled an alpha motor neuron, and the other one is labeled a gamma motor neuron. Now, most somatic motor neurons are good old regular alpha motor neurons. That's the name of a somatic motor neuron that controls and activates our skeletal muscles to contract. So what are gamma motor neurons, gamma somatic motor neurons? Those are the special somatic motor neurons, and we have much fewer of them. They simply control the tension of these intrafusal muscle fibers within the muscle spindle. All right, so there is a difference between alpha and gamma somatic motor neurons. Let's go back to page 89. So back on page 89, so what's the role of the muscle spindle? Or more precisely, what's the role of the muscle stretch receptor? All right, so we wrote these muscle spindles are really a type of proprioceptor. We wrote that whenever there is passive stretching of a muscle, that stretches the muscle and the muscle spindle within the muscle, which activates that sensory neuron called the muscle stretch receptor to send an AP, an action potential, to the central nervous system. which is going to result in the activation of a somatic motor neuron, a good old regular alpha somatic motor neuron, causing a reflex contraction of the muscle to its original length. Now, you might be scratching your head thinking, what the hell does that mean? So let's just go right to a specific example. The example that we want to use is the one you're very familiar with, the stretch reflex of the Quadriceps femoris muscle, more commonly called the Patellar Reflex or knee jerk. But the technical name for the reflex that you call the knee jerk or patellar reflex is more properly called the stretch reflex of the Quadriceps femoris muscle. Now, the first thing that I wrote here on the left is you're going to tap the leg. And that's going to cause flexion at the knee. So before we tell you anything more about what happens with the reflex, let's make sure we know how to tap our knee. All right, now I have a hammer here. And you're thinking, aren't you going to give me a hammer? No, because you don't need the hammer. You have to know where to tap. So let's think about it, all right? So I want you to just feel your knee, all right? And you can feel your kneecap, your patella. About an inch below your kneecap, there's a bump. Anybody remember the name of that bump? The tibial tuberosity. Anybody remember that bump? Can you feel that bump? It's a rounded bump about an inch below the bottom of your kneecap. Feel that rounded bump? That's the tibial tuberosity. You'd say, okay, so who cares? The Quadriceps femoris muscle on the front of your thigh attaches, it inserts on the tibial tuberosity. So where you tap is right between the bottom of the patella, the bottom of the kneecap, and the tibial tuberosity. That's where you tap. So you'll feel it kind of goes in right there. It goes in. It's indented right there. So why don't you just put your fingers in there, right between the bottom of your kneecap and the tibial tuberosity, right between it, and just tap it. Because I'm not faking this. I can give it a tap and it triggers it. Now if you got really thick genes, that might interfere with it, but it should feel sensitive right there. If you can take the side of your fingers, the side of your hand, or just your fingertips. Can anybody trigger? You feel anything going on there? Now to help, the best way to do this is to cross your leg. Because if you get a trigger the reflex, your foot can't be on the floor. All right? So let's cross our leg, and we want to tap right between the bottom of our kneecap and just above the tibial tuberosity. Can you do that? Are you eliciting it? Try to do it. Because if you know where to tap, you don't need a hammer. If you don't know where to tap, a crowbar won't help. The importance is knowing where to tap, not having the hammer. The hammer's not the important thing, it's knowing where to tap. Can everybody got that? All right, so now that we've told you where to tap, so we all know how this works, what's actually going on? So I'm going to, in an exaggerated way, try to demonstrate what's actually happening. So when you tap, and I don't know if this is appearing, I'll back this up. I don't know, see if this shows up. All right, so what's actually happening is this. So I'm putting my leg up. So now, you're tapping right here. Now, let me exaggerate what you're doing. You tap, which causes flexion. Right? You're tapping on the leg. That's going to flex. And what's the reflex? Extend. Or let's put it this way. Action, reaction. You caused flexion, you get a reflex extension. Now that's what you're doing with this, the reflex. What is the most common thing when you're just standing in place? What's the most common thing that would cause your leg to bend? Gravity. Didn't we say earlier, gravity wants your knees to buckle to pull you down to the floor. So in other words, all that we are doing is we are mimicking what gravity does to us all the time when we're standing upright. We are simply doing what gravity causes. Gravity is causing our knees to bend. and pulling us down to the floor. And we're just triggering it. And this reflex, anytime gravity starts to cause our knees to buckle, to bend, the reflex re-extends our legs, keeping us standing upright. You follow that? That's the purpose of the reflex, to counteract gravity. We're just testing it to see if it's working. So with that in mind, let's see what we actually wrote here. So we wrote that when you tap the leg, you cause flexion, bending of the leg. And when you stretch, when you bend that leg, that actually stretches the quadriceps muscle. We'll show you a picture showing you that. When you stretch the quadriceps, that also stretches that muscle spindle structure that is embedded within the muscle, activating that sensory neuron called a muscle stretch receptor. That muscle stretch receptor, sensory neuron, sends a signal to your spinal cord, to your central nervous system, and it's going to cause activation of a somatic motor neuron. Which somatic motor neuron? The somatic motor neuron that controls your quadriceps muscle. And when you activate the quadriceps muscle to contract, you learn this in anatomy. When the quadriceps contracts, it extends the lower leg. So that's how the reflex works. So now let's see a picture of this on the next page. So on page 90, and I must tell you that this picture on the top of page 90 is one of my favorite pictures in this lecture outline. And the reason why I love this picture is its sheer simplicity. We know that we must be talking about physiology and not anatomy with this picture, because anatomy books are filled with beautiful pictures of muscles and bones and all that, and this is a very simplified line drawing. Because in physiology, we're not interested in what things look like. We're trying to understand how they work. So here's what it's showing. Let's zoom it in. All right, so where you tap is right here. This is the quadriceps femoris muscle. This is the tendon of insertion. It goes right over the kneecap, the patella, and inserts on a bump right here on the tibia called the tibiotuberosity. You tap right here between the bottom of the kneecap, the patella, and the tibiotuberosity where it's sensitive. Now, what we do is we tap, and that causes the leg to bend. As the leg bends, that stretches this muscle. And flexing the leg stretches this muscle. Now, why is this muscle stretched? Because it's attached by this tendon onto the tibia. And when this leg bends, that stretches the muscle. And it causes stretching of the muscle spindles that are embedded within the muscle. We said that wrapped around those intrafusal muscle cells in the muscle spindle are muscle stretch receptors. And they are activated when these intrafusal muscle cells are stretched. So when the muscle and the intrafusal muscle cells in the muscle spindle are stretched, that activates an action potential in this muscle stretch receptor sensory neuron. Here's the cell body of this sensory neuron. It's located right outside the spinal cord in the dorsal root ganglion, and it's shown synapsing in the spinal cord. Now, each sensory neuron would synapse onto 100 neurons. Here it just shows it synapsing onto 2. It in reality would synapse onto 100. One of the interneurons that it synapses onto and activates is an interneuron that sends the signal up to our brain. And because that signal ends up going to our brain, we feel what's happened. But even if somebody had severing, if their spinal cord was severed, this signal would never reach the brain and they would never feel anything. But that wouldn't stop the reflex from working, because the actual reflex involves activation of this somatic motor neuron, and this somatic motor neuron is the somatic motor neuron that activates the quadriceps femoris muscle to contract. When the quadriceps contracts, what does contraction mean? To shorten. If I contract myself, I make myself shorter. So if this quadriceps contracts, it gets shorter, it pulls the insertion closer to the origin, it pulls on the tibia and extends the lower leg. So activation of the quadriceps extends the lower leg. That's what we said it does. It extends the lower leg. So here's it in a nutshell. When you tap the knee, that flexes the leg. That causes a reflex extension of the leg. So it's very simple. Action, reaction. You bent the leg, and the leg returns back to its original position. The purpose of a reflex is to return some condition of the body back to the original desired location. It's the original desired state. That's the purpose of a reflex. If you are overheated, what is the purpose of sweating? To cool you down and bring the temperature of your body back to the original desired state. If you bent the leg using that hammer, the reflex returns the leg back to its original position before you bent it. Action, reaction. Now, another facet of this, let's look right below. This gives us a little bit more detail of this anti-gravity stretch reflex. So, just reviewing the anatomy. This is the knee, right? Here's the femur, here's the tibia, here's the tibiotuberosity. This is the quadriceps femoris muscle. Here's the tendon of insertion, and it inserts right at the tibiotuberosity. Now here's the quadriceps. Now we want to remind you that all of the muscles in our body are organized into opposing groups. There is an antagonist on the backside of your thigh. The antagonist muscles are the muscles that flex your lower leg. They are commonly collectively called in English the hamstring group. More precisely, they include the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. But let me just focus on one of those three, the biceps femoris. So that is the muscle, the big muscle that flexes your lower leg. The quadriceps is the muscle that extends your lower leg. So here's the antagonist, the flexor muscle. Here's the quadriceps, the extensor muscle. Why do I mention that? You'll see. So it shows embedded in the quadriceps femoris muscle are these muscle spindles. Whenever this leg is bent, and one of the things that would bend it is if I tap it, that'll bend it, or gravity bends it, that stretches this muscle. That stretches it and activates an action potential in this muscle stretch receptor. So this muscle stretch receptor is labeled the afferent neuron from the spindle. That's the muscle stretch receptor. What's afferent mean? It's a synonym for sensory neuron. An afferent neuron is a sensory neuron. Did we ever learn that sensory and motor pathways are also called afferent and efferent pathways? Yes, back in section C, and several times since. So here's this sensory or afferent neuron sending an action potential. Here's the cell body of this sensory neuron in the dorsal root ganglion. It enters the spinal cord, synapses on a bunch of neurons. One of the neurons that it activates, and sensory neurons always excite, they always release excitatory neurotransmitters, it activates a somatic motor neuron. It's got a plus sign there. It excites it. And this somatic motor neuron sends an action potential represented by these arrowheads right back to the quadriceps muscle. It causes the quadriceps to contract, and as it contracts, that extends the lower leg. But we've got a problem. You'd say, what's the problem? Can we go home now? What's the problem? The problem is this. If we want the quadriceps to contract and extend the lower leg, but there's an opposing muscle that might possibly interfere with the leg extending. So in order to make sure that this leg, lower leg, will extend, we have to make sure that the opposing muscle is relaxed. How do we make sure that the hamstring muscles, including the biceps femoris, is relaxed? The only way we can make sure that it's relaxed and therefore will not oppose extension of the lower leg is we have to inhibit the somatic motor neuron that innervates that opposing muscle. So looking here at the spinal cord, you can see that this muscle stretch receptor sensory neuron not only excited or activated the somatic motor neuron to the quadriceps, it also activated, represented by a plus sign, an interneuron right here. This interneuron is labeled an inhibitory interneuron because when it's activated, it releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Now, haven't we learned that there are interneurons in our central nervous system? Some we release excitatory chemicals and some release inhibitory. This interneuron, when it's activated, when it conducts an action potential, it releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter that hyperpolarizes, that inhibits this somatic motor neuron, represented by that minus sign. This somatic motor neuron is being inhibited. That ensures that this muscle will stay relaxed because we are inhibiting the somatic motor neuron that could activate it. So now we know that when this somatic motor neuron activates the quadriceps to contract, to extend the leg, the antagonist muscle will remain relaxed and not oppose that, not prevent it. Now there is a term for this concept that I've just described. And the term for the concept that I've just described is called reciprocal innervation. And what is reciprocal innervation? Whenever the motor neuron to a muscle is excited, the motor neuron to the opposing or antagonist muscle must be inhibited. That way you know that you will get that reflex response that you want, and nothing will interfere with it. Now notice what we're doing here in this physiology class. You'd say, what are we doing? We're taking the information you learned in anatomy, because in anatomy you were taught not only agonist but antagonist. And we're showing you that that was more important than you thought, because these reflexes involve innervation of one muscle, but also a way of inhibiting the antagonist muscle. And that way we can get the reflex response we want. So let's just summarize this quadriceps one more time on the previous page, 89. So how does the knee jerk work? You can see there's more to this knee jerk than you thought. Now you know that the purpose of the knee jerk is to counteract gravity. Because the thing that most commonly is causing, when we're just standing upright, and I know that it was suggested when we walk, we certainly do flex our leg. But if we were just standing in one place, not walking, what is tending to cause our legs to buckle or flex when we're not walking is gravity. So we have a built-in reflex to counteract that gravity effect that would tend to cause our knees to buckle when we would pull us down to the ground. So all that we're doing when we tap the lower leg is we are mimicking the action of gravity. And we are simply seeing if this anti-gravity reflex is working. So we tap the leg, causing flexion at the knee, flexion of the lower leg. That stretches that quadriceps muscle and activates the muscle stretch receptor to send a signal to our spinal cord, to the central nervous system. That sensory neuron activates the somatic motor neuron to the quadriceps, and that's going to, when the quadriceps contracts, when it's activated to contract, that extends your lower leg. But we've also learned on page 90 that we're also going to see this phenomenon called reciprocal innervation. That at the same time the somatic motor neuron to the quadriceps is activated, we are going to see simultaneously inhibition of the somatic motor neuron that controls the antagonist muscle, the hamstring muscle, so that it will not interfere with this reflex response. On the next page, on page 91, there are a whole bunch of anti-gravity stretch reflexes shown at the bottom half. So on the bottom half of the page, it shows testing for the Biceps Brachii anti-gravity stretch reflex. Here it shows doing the knee jerk or patellar reflex. That's the one we just described. Over here it shows testing for the Triceps Brachii anti-gravity reflex. And then it shows here the so-called plantar reflex, which I'll touch upon yet. So there's a whole bunch of these reflexes. It doesn't take long to learn where you tap the little hammer. But to understand what you're doing and what the purpose of it's for takes a lot more effort. That's why in this class I try to emphasize understanding rather than just spending too much time tapping our knees. Let's just show you one more example of this anti-gravity stretch reflex. Let's use the example of testing the biceps brachii muscle. This is shown at the top. It works absolutely the same as testing the knee jerk. All right, so here in the middle of the page, here's the humerus and the radius, right? Radius and ulna, the lower arm. This is the flexor muscle, the muscle that flexes the forearm. And we know from anatomy the major prime mover, the major most important muscle that causes flexion of the lower arm is the biceps brachii. We also remind you there's an antagonist. It's on the back side of the arm. It's called the triceps brachii. That's the muscle that extends the forearm. Now, how do we test the stretch reflex of the biceps brachii muscle? How do we test it? How did we test the quadriceps muscle? Here was our thinking. Follow me. What does the quadriceps femoris muscle do? It extends the lower leg. You memorize that in anatomy. So how did we test it? We did the opposite of what that muscle causes. Since the quadriceps femoris extends the lower leg, you know how we tested it? We flexed the lower leg to trigger the reflex. So if we want to test the biceps brachii, what action does the biceps brachii muscle have? It flexes the forearm. So what should we do to trigger the reflex? We should extend the forearm. Does that make sense? You do the opposite of what the muscle causes that you're testing. So you first ask, the muscle I want to test, what is its action? And I will use my little hammer to do the opposite of what that muscle causes. So if the biceps flexes, I'm going to tap the arm and extend. So that's what we show here. This arrow shows that we are going to tap the arm and extend it. As we extend the arm, that stretches the biceps brachii, including the muscle spindle embedded within it. That activates the stretch receptor sensory neuron. Let's follow the arrows. And the muscle stretch receptor sensory neuron cell body is in the dorsal root ganglion. It enters the spinal cord and it synapses onto a bunch of neurons. One of the neurons that it activates, represented by a plus sign, is a somatic motor neuron. It fires off an action potential. Let's follow it down. And that action potential is sent to the biceps brachii muscle. And when you activate the biceps brachii muscle, what is the action of the biceps brachii? It flexes the forearm. Action, reaction. You extended the lower arm. The reflex is you flex the lower arm. But we are reminded of this concept called reciprocal innervation. If whenever we're going to activate the somatic motor neuron to one muscle, we must make sure that the opposing muscle is relaxed. How does that happen? In exactly the same way it happened with the knee jerk. This muscle stretch receptor is also shown activating an inner neuron, an inhibitory inner neuron, that releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter represented by a minus sign that inhibits this somatic motor neuron. That ensures that this somatic motor neuron will not activate the extensor muscle. So now we know that we are activating the biceps brachii muscle to contract and flex the forearm, and at the same time the opposing triceps brachii is kept in the relaxed state, the passive state, by inhibiting the somatic motor neuron that controls it. This is called, as it says right here, reciprocal innervation. Let's just look at this at the bottom of the page, the lower right. So on the lower right, and I know I ask this all the time, is anybody in this class interested in OT or PT? Okay, so this is all really important for you. You're going to thank me when you get into the program. Now, has anybody in this class had a course in developmental psychology? All right, now, in developmental psychology, you learn that as the nervous system matures, we can expect different stages of what the child is capable of doing based on the maturing of the nervous system. So one of the interesting things is that if you stroke, with your finger, with this, right, with a feather, the sole of the foot, it tickles. It tickles and your toes curl, right? If I stroke, if somebody goes and strokes the sole of your foot, tickles and your toes curl. Sometimes, though, instead of the toes curling, they may actually extend. And when that does, that's called a Babinski sign, named after Dr. Babinski. Now, for those of you who had a developmental psych class, you learned Babinski sign. Anybody hear about that? In what context? Why? Better remember? I'm going to tell you. If you stroke the sole of a newborn's foot, of an infant's foot, you get the Babinski sign. In other words, an infant, if you stroke the sole of their foot, their toes don't curl like it does in us, but it actually causes the toes to extend. They don't have a normal reflex, not because they've got a pathology, but because their nervous system hasn't yet fully developed. So in fact, their toes extend out. Now this is why because this reflex isn't yet fully developed yet in an infant, that's why that infant cannot yet stand upright or walk. So by time that infant reaches about 1.5 years of age, 1 year of age, whatever it might be, correct me if you've had the developmental psych class. So they're going to start to stand and then take their first step. And so we might ask then, at what age do we start to see the normal reflex? At the same age they're able to stand up. Because if you were to hold a child, right, you hold them, and you let their feet touch the surface of a table, their feet bend. They cannot have their sole of their foot flat on a flat surface. Does anybody know what I'm talking about with an infant? their feet cannot stand flat on a flat surface. Just let their sole of their feet touch a flat surface and they bend. So they cannot yet stand upright. So their nervous system has to develop further and mature to the point where their foot can stand upright. And once they start to show this normal plantar reflex, this normal reflex of the sole of their foot, they are now able to stand upright. Now, of course, if we had an adult where we didn't see the normal reflex, but we saw this, that would be pathological. That would be showing something in the nervous system is definitely not working